All right, welcome to everybody for our next session, Blossom Over Burnout with Samantha Webb and Dr. Weinsz. I know it's right at 1:31. We'll wait just a couple more seconds. Let Dr. Weinsz and Sam take their last swig of water, maybe. But what we'll do is we will thank you all for joining us. I'll give Sam and Dr. Weinsz a couple minutes to introduce themselves first. And we will have the chat open. So if you would like to put your questions in the chat, they will address those at the end, like when we have time for question and answers. So with it being 1:31, we'll go ahead and get started. Introducing, I'll have Sam introduce herself first and then Dr. Weinsz, and then we can get started.
Okay, thank you, Erica. Hello, everyone. My name is Samantha Webb. And before we get started, I just wanted to give a little shout out to the Academic Center for Student Athletes here at LSU, just for putting on this summit. And thank you to all of y'all for attending and being a part of our presentation today. We hope that you'll be able to take away some good information, some key insights that you can utilize and apply in your work with student athletes. So the title of our presentation today is Blossom Over Burnout, Promoting Balance and Wellness in Student Athletes. Like I said, my name is Samantha Webb, and I'll be presenting today with Dr. Melissa Weinsz. So a little bit about myself. I started working at the Academic Center for Student Athletes at LSU back in August of 2020 as a tutorial graduate assistant. And in this role, I've been able to work one-on-one with student athletes in a tutoring dynamic, while also assisting with educational support services. This past year, I've gotten the opportunity to work at LSU Sports Psychology and Counseling as a counseling intern, in which I've worked with student athletes in a therapeutic setting and promoting holistic mental health and wellness, as well as some performance work. This May, I'm looking to graduate with a master's in counselor education and hopefully become licensed as a professional counselor.
Good afternoon, everyone. I could not echo Sam more in saying we're so thankful to have each of you on this call with us today. My name is Dr. Melissa Weinsz. I've been at LSU. On Monday, it'll be 2 years, which I cannot believe. I was at University of Florida previously to this, but I came to LSU in a capacity to be the assistant director of Tiger Life, which is our life skills programming here at LSU, and was recently promoted to the director of student athlete professional development. Was a student athlete myself in college way back in the day. Played basketball and lacrosse and started in strength and conditioning and finagled my way into sports psych and then athlete development, and here we are.
So our hope and goal for each of you as a result of participating in this presentation today is that you will be able to define burnout and understand its significance to the student athlete population, be able to identify and assess burnout in the student athlete population, as well as be able to provide resources and tools to aid in prevention and treatment of burnout. So what is burnout and why is this important? Over the past few years, I feel like I've begun to hear this term a lot more frequently. And I think that goes to show kind of our awareness and our understanding growing with what burnout is. I've also become more aware for myself as a counselor, how important it is to prioritize time and taking care of myself so that I can hold that highest standard of care when working with student athletes and clients. This is also something that I've heard in conversations when I've met with student athletes in a counseling setting. And so I think it's an important topic to really discuss, to be aware of and mindful of in our work. So burnout is listed in the ICD-11. Those of you who aren't familiar with the ICD, this is the International Classification of Diseases. So this is a worldwide and global listing of all medical diseases and disorders. If you're familiar with the DSM, then you would know that the DSM pulls its mental health disorders from the ICD. And burnout is listed as a syndrome conceptualized as resulting in chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. So this can cause impairment and damage at the cognitive, emotional, and attitudinal levels. Burnout can affect anyone in any role, but for the purpose of this presentation today, we're going to specifically focus on burnout impacting student athletes. So prevalence rates of burnout in athletes can range upwards of 9%. This statistic here is from 2007. And so I would be curious to see what a more recent number might be if this has increased, especially with COVID and things of that nature. So as I said earlier, burnout embodies stress, but to reduce burnout to only be stress would be a oversimplification of what it is. So burnout also includes these three dimensions. So first, exhaustion. So feelings of emotional and physical fatigue brought on by the psychosocial and physical demands associated with training and competing. So student athletes have a lot of expectations that are placed on them and a lot of pressure. They are expected to be at their workouts and practices and competing, and that can be a lot to deal with. They also have to be in class and be at tutoring, and they're also developing as 18 to 20 something year olds. What I've heard in my work with student athletes as well is that there's this correlation between effort and exhaustion. And if student athletes aren't exhausted after a workout or a game, then they feel as though they haven't given full effort, which ultimately isn't super sustainable. The next dimension is sport devaluation, so negative and detached attitudes towards the sport, which is reflected by a lack of concern regarding the sport itself and the athlete's performance quality. So here, the athlete might begin to question why they're continuing to play the sport. They might feel some frustration with, this is a sport that they've loved for so long, but now it is beginning to feel like it's working against them. And then the third dimension is reduced sense of achievement. So feelings of inefficiency and a tendency to evaluate oneself negatively in terms of sport performance and accomplishment. So here the athlete might feel as though they're not reaching their standard of achievement. And each of these dimensions here will influence the others. So if a student athlete's feeling exhausted, it might impact how they're valuing their sport and how their achievement is in terms of their standards, and vice versa for all of these dimensions. So burnout is going to occur over stages. This is a gradual process where essentially at first demands are placed on the athlete. So there are these expectations, the training loads and the pressure to perform at this elite level. The next stage is going to be how the student athlete is interpreting the situation. So in the beginning years, this might seem super fun, super exciting that they're engaging in their sport, but eventually that might lead to them feeling like this is exceeding their own personal resources and their own personal capacity. So at stage 3, this would be where the student athlete is interpreting these demands as being threatening or overwhelming, which essentially can lead to a physiological and affective response. So a physiological response is going to be those physical feelings that the student athlete might have. So maybe that is the feeling of fatigue, exhaustion, and then an affective response is going to be an emotional one. So maybe the student athlete is more irritable or more moody, things of that nature, which will bring us into stage 4. Those responses will lead to behavioral consequences. So this could be increased performance, avoidant behavior, or withdrawal from the sport. With this, there's a spectrum to burnout. So not everyone might be at a severe or extreme case of burnout. It could be more mild. It really all depends on the situation and the student. So with student athletes, participating in athletics can be such a rewarding experience. It can offer a lot of opportunities for growth, development, learning new skills and things of that nature. But student athletes are also susceptible and at risk for developing burnout. Some of those predisposing factors include being high achievers or striving for maximal performance, which sounds like student athletes. They are committed to their sport. They are striving to be elite performers. Perpetuating factors are going to be the ones that will continuously contribute to burnout, which include the workload, the emotional demands, lack of autonomy, lack of social support, maladaptive coping strategies. So with this, it's the student athlete does have a lot on their plate that they are doing on a day-to-day basis. They have a lot of pressure to perform from various people in their lives. They have a set schedule that's made for them that they can't really deviate too much from. And they might not feel like they have people in their lives that they can talk to about this and be vulnerable with. And maladaptive coping strategies, they might feel as though they haven't developed strong coping strategies yet. Whereas some of the protective factors are going to be things like resilience, some personality traits of being optimistic, agreeable, open, having social support and people in their lives that they can trust and lean on when they need that support, and having healthy coping strategies. So really emphasizing why this is important is when we look at these consequences. As people working in athletics and support, we care about lifting up these students and helping them to achieve this wellness so that they can be successful in their lives. So the consequences can impact student athletes on an individual level, but this can also lead to an organizational impact as well. So looking more so at the individual consequences, like psychological, this is going to be where there's this negative impact on things such as concentration and memory, difficulty in making decisions, reduced ability to cope, symptoms of anxiety and depression, low self-esteem, dissatisfaction with life. Physiological symptoms are going to be things such as headaches, increased vulnerability to infections, insomnia, chronic fatigue, increase in blood cortisol levels, and then behavioral, that counterproductive behavior, maybe some alcohol and drug use, low commitment to the organization, turnover, dropout, and reductions in performance. So these three areas of consequences can then translate to impact the organization as a whole. So what that team might look like, which could include low motivation and achievement within the organization, causing a reduction in the overall quality of performance. So these are things that we want to be mindful of to work towards preventing and to hopefully uplift the student athlete.
All right, switching gears a little bit. When Sam and I started collaborating on this project, we both immediately, were drawn to our empath self of we want to hear the stories, we want to know how student athletes are doing in combination with our passion for what we're doing on a daily basis. So as Sam mentioned before, she's been involved in a plethora of different student support services, from learning assistance and support to sports psych, and I'm in the student athlete development side of the house. So as student athlete support professionals, I know everyone in this room can relate to the fact that we have the blessing to care for and assist student athletes during all peaks and valleys of their collegiate career. And we can provide a brave space for them to talk about these external personal pressures and the athletic and academic obligations that they're navigating. And all those things, as Sam mentioned, can drastically affect their quality of their experience while they're in college, particularly within their student athlete experience. So we said we got to go to the student athletes to get the crux of this and see what they're experiencing. Okay, so our sample for this qualitative intake was a convenience sample. So whoever was in our building on that day, whoever Sam and I had good relationships with, student athletes that were involved in both our Student Athlete Advisory Council and Black Student Athlete Association, were all willing and excited to engage in this conversation. And we had the opportunity to connect with 12 total, 5 male and 7 female. All of them were upperclassmen, so juniors, seniors, and grad students. And they were comprised or were a part of the swim and dive team, gymnastics, track and field, basketball, golf, volleyball, and soccer. So we had a lot of teams represented in this very small sample. And all 12 experienced a self-assessed feeling of burnout during their collegiate career. If they weren't in it now, they had already experienced it before. And also interesting to note, 12 of these student athletes self-identified their enhancers. So they either focus primarily on these external locuses of control. So coach, family, academic, societal expectations, that's really what keeps them moving or can exasperate their feeling of burnout. And then their type A personalities, which I think we can probably all relate to as well. So we're very driven, ambitious, want to be successful, and those things can lead to us being more stressed and prone to depression and anxiety and other things that are associated with burnout as well. So without telling our student athletes, hey, this is the definition of burnout, we wanted to know what they thought it was. And it was really cool to see that this definition varied drastically across sports. When Sam and I actually conduct this study and gain IRB approval and send it in for publication, I think it'd be really important for us to look at the all-year competition schedule sports like track and field, swim and dive, tennis, sports that have competitions that go throughout the year as opposed to a consolidated amount of time. I think we should look at gender, and I also think that we should look at year in school. You know, our sample, as I previously mentioned, was mostly upperclassmen, so I think it could be really interesting to see how freshmen and sophomore are also experiencing the sense or feeling of burnout. So they said burnout is a whole conglomerate of different things, but I'm going to try to hit on some of these highlights here. But mental and physical wear on the body, not having the mental, physical, and emotional capacity, feeling worthless if they're unable to perform, and no longer really enjoying doing what originally made them happy. They're questioning their consistent drive. A lot of student athletes also mentioned that their burnout was directly related to their coach's inability to communicate. They felt a lack of motivation by their current sense of purpose, which really truly was their sport at this particular phase in their life. And their main purpose in life didn't feel as important anymore. And it was kind of interesting how themes that we identified fell perfectly into the different themes that Sam previously mentioned from I'm going to butcher the last name of this researcher, but Adu Valashana and his colleagues for 2022. The reference will be on our reference side at the end if you'd like to go back and look at the structure of burnout. But the themes that we identified were grouped into either circumstances that triggered their burnout, so work overload, emotional demands, their specific personality, consequences of that burnout. So as Sam also mentioned, psychological, physical, and behavioral, and then also their coping styles or lack thereof in response to the burnout. So specifically for circumstances, as Sam also mentioned before, burnout is a syndrome. It's not primarily a consequence of exposure to certain, or it is primarily a consequence of exposure to certain organizational and individual work conditions. It's not an individual characteristic or personality trait. So our student athletes identified 2 organizational and 1 individual condition to where they identified something is triggering their burnout. So with work overload, as I said before, emotional and physical exhaustion and inadequate rest really heightened their sense of burnout. Emotional demands that they experienced, so coaching expectations, coaching changes in the way that their coaches communicated, and also their individual personality. So reduced sense of achievement was an issue for some, and also a found sense of autonomy influenced how they felt attached to their sport. Specifically for work overload, research has found that burnout generates physiological and social costs, which I think we all can relate to from a personal experience, and also from working with our student athletes. So when the student athletes were asked, have you ever felt that you were just mentally and physically exhausted? Y'all, all 12 of them said absolutely before they answered this question. So they all have definitely felt that way. They always feel exhausted no matter how much they sleep. They're sometimes too stressed to eat. On their rest days, when they finally have a second to stop, they sleep for 14 plus hours and they just feel exhausted all the time. And a lot of them are getting inadequate rest. And really the only time they get a chance to stop and relax is during taper or break periods, which even those stints of time are exceedingly short. So it was unanimous across all student athletes that we talked to that they have, and honestly, most of them currently still are experiencing emotional and physical exhaustion throughout their season. And it's interesting to note that all year competition sports talked about the gradual onset of their burnout and how it almost felt like a chronic symptom as opposed to an acute point in time to where they just felt completely debilitated and burnt out from their sport. So next, for emotional demands, this comes from controlling or trying to hide negative emotions that they have, such as anger, irritation, discomfort, or trying to comply with rules and requirements from their team and their coach. So when asked, have you ever felt burnt out due to competing in your sport throughout your collegiate career? It was also interesting to see this unanimous, just long exhalation sigh when they started to share their experience. It's almost like they're going to sit and settle into this long stint of a story that they wanted to share with me. And this question is where we spend a majority of our time speaking with participants as well. So they felt like communication from their coach influenced the way that they're able to connect with their sport. Some coaches telling them you're not made for this particular league, or not communicating with them in general made them feel like they didn't belong or have a space in that sport. They experienced a multitude of different coaching changes, upwards of 4 or 5 across various institutions. So with that many coaches, it was difficult to figure out how to best communicate with them. So they felt uncomfortable expressing the different frustrations and feelings that they were experiencing, and often became confused by their emotions. So they just became emotionally drained and didn't know where to displace the emotions that they were experiencing. So when some student athletes were defining burnout, they immediately mentioned their coach's inability to communicate, or their extremely high expectations and standards of their team, which led to the burnout. And then with athletes' personality, this was the last and final circumstance sub-theme that we identified. And the reduced sense of achievement is more is better, but never enough. So particularly amongst the runners, swimmers, and golfers, they had this guilt that they kept mentioning. So guilt associated to not completing workouts. They had to hit all of their miles and all the sets that were programmed, and they didn't really acknowledge when their body needed rest. So more is always better, but you can never truly do enough in their eyes. And they also had a found sense of autonomy to where they're looking more towards their future at the end of their collegiate career. They understood their sport more. So the sport wasn't the focus of what they were doing. They're thinking about this next step. They wanted to potentially question their coaches, but they felt like they couldn't really say anything. So that made them feel disassociated to their sport as well. And it's been empirically proven that the only way to really halt this cycle of natural burnout is to rest. And usually not satisfying the perception of our current student athletes, because they don't want to stop. They want to push through these negative symptoms that they do experience. And student athletes have reported that they almost feel trapped within the circumstances of their sport. So in other words, they recognize that they need to stop, but they feel compelled to continue because they want to keep their scholarship. They want to keep their starting role. They really want to be an important member of their team. But as I said before, more is better, but they never really truly feel like it is enough. Okay. Moving on to consequences. I know we're running short on time, so I'm going to try to speed through this. As Sam previously mentioned, there are a multitude of different consequences that come from being burned out in regard to psychological, physical, behavioral, and organizational. And our student athletes identified all of those besides the organizational one. For psychological, empirical studies have shown that psychological examples have been identified as anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, irritability, and feeling detached. The irritability and feeling detached was running rampant throughout the student athletes that we had the opportunity to connect with. So they would talk about how they'd cry for no reason. They would get snippy with people that they love. They stopped answering phone calls. They felt like they were rude without reason. And they were just mentally and emotionally just exhausted. So they were rude to their teammates. And some of them even said, I feel like I'm ready for something different. I'm done with my sport. I feel underwhelmed by the opportunity to compete and be with my team. So majority of student athletes mentioned their mood negatively shifted when they're experiencing burnout. They're irritable, lashing out at people that they love. And several also felt like, they'd reached the end of their sport and they're just done with that trajectory of their life and they're ready to move on to the next step. Okay, so for physical health, chronic fatigue and illness were mentioned as a consequence of majority of our student athletes. They talked about they would fall asleep immediately as soon as they would lay down at the end of the day. Their body would shut down. They would get really sick. They didn't really understand how to fix their body, and they would just constantly be trying to perform so well in school and their sport at the same time that they would just become exhausted. So almost all student athletes mentioned getting sick or feeling fatigue during very stressful times in the academic school year and also their athletic competition season. And that's really when they felt the least motivated to engage in participate in their sport. And then our final consequence or sub-theme identified was behavioral. So a lot of student athletes mentioned the counterproductive behaviors that they would engage in when they felt completely just exhausted from their sport. They almost quit their sport, started engaging on healthy coping practices, and it set them back physically and emotionally as well. So burnout led a few of the student athletes within the sample to engage in those counterproductive behaviors. But something really cool to note is that every student athlete that mentioned those counterproductive behaviors also mentioned that they had connected with our sports psych department or our mental health professional. So they were aware of those behaviors and they wanted to reroute behaviors as well. And then last but not least, our final theme was coping strategies that we identified. So when asking student athletes, what self-care practices do you engage in when you start to feel overwhelmed? They shared their current active strategies, so engaging in things that they love or seeking family support, and then also their perception of the resources that they have or lack thereof. So many student athletes could immediately identify, hey, like I love, working on my car, fishing, playing video games, hanging out with my friends, going outside. It was very easy for them to identify something that helped them escape from those feelings of burnout. A lot of individuals also mentioned, I lean on my family members, I talk to my friends, and people help me get through these feelings of burnout. And a lot of them said they also want to avoid reality by doing things that they love and enjoy. So 10 out of our 12 student athletes were able to easily identify various coping strategies. And then thanks, Sam. Availability and support. The majority of student athletes understood and knew where to find resources and how to navigate burnout. And a lot of them came from sports psych conversations. So they would engage in positive self-affirmation, avoid the 5 S's, and only 1 or 2 mentioned, hey, no one ever taught me how to do this. I don't know how to navigate burnout. So 8 out of the 12 student athletes mentioned utilizing our sports psych department, who has done an exceptional job identifying needs and specific tools and resources for student athletes to work through this ebb and flow of burnout, which perfectly segues into Sam's next part of our toolkit.
Okay, so now looking at what can we do about this? How can we combat burnout? What role can we play in prevention and treatment? So I broke this down into 2 different sections. What can we do on a more macro level? So looking within the organizations, and then on a micro level. So what can we promote in this individual? So looking at the macro level, there's different tools and interventions that we can be mindful of and using with student athletes. So the first being coaching and guidance. This is going to be more of a non-directive approach that really just encompasses encouragement. So encouraging the student athlete to take back their control or really be mindful of what they can control in that situation, especially when it's coming to their emotional state and their well-being. So assuming that they're at that capacity to do that and that they're not fully burnt out. The next is support groups. So utilizing that team dynamic and that social support to help cope with difficulties and challenges. This is to bring about that sense of community and that sense of belonging that's so crucial and engaging as a student athlete. And then lastly, utilizing a strengths-based intervention. So focusing on what strengths does this student athlete have? Are there some innate abilities they have or some learned characteristics that they've grown into, and bringing those to the forefront of the mind so that they can utilize those to face this adversity, because that in and of itself is going to be motivating. So now looking at what the individual can do. The first is going to be promoting a healthy lifestyle. So a good key step in starting this would be to identify what is a healthy lifestyle? What does that look like to this individual? A lot of the times that's going to incorporate some sort of balance. So specifically looking at a balanced diet, getting enough rest is going to be essential, that sleep routine, sleep cycle. And I would imagine most student athletes are engaging in some sort of physical exercise already. The next would be mindfulness training. So working on those skills of being mindful, being present, utilizing meditation. A lot of times this is going to be a challenge for this population because, as we've discussed, they're always on the go, always working. But incorporating that presence and bringing themselves back to the here and now can help in reducing burnout so that the student isn't worrying about what's coming up in the future or ruminating about what's in the past. They can really be present in their current situation. And then self-reflection. So really observing self and taking time to reflect on what am I feeling? What am I experiencing? What emotions are coming up in order to really connect with the self and be more in tune with oneself. So continuing with the micro level, another resource is therapy and counseling. So this can be really helpful in order to promote certain skills, such as emotional regulation and relaxation skills, as well as just having a space to really be vulnerable and speak about what one might be experiencing and work on those healthy coping strategies. Time management. So as I stated earlier, a lot of times student athletes are given their set schedule and can't really waver too far off of that, but really making sure that time for the student is incorporated into their schedule so that they have time to rest, time to relax, and things of that nature. And then job crafting. So this is where someone would adjust their job, reconfigure their job to where it really aligns with what's important to them, what their values are, and what are their needs to make that work more meaningful and more fulfilling. So how can they focus on their sport in a way that really encapsulates what's important about their sport? What do they love about it? And how can I incorporate more of that into my life? And then I listed some additional considerations. I had stated earlier that resilience is such a protective factor that so many student athletes have and have learned and built through facing adversity. Resilience will be such a strength in really fighting burnout and dealing with some of those hardships. Self-compassion as well. A lot of student athletes and individuals are so self-critical that this is a key piece that's missing a lot of times. And this can help when perfection and high performance is expected, to where that individual can have grace for themselves in order to achieve happiness and enjoyment and overall wellness within their lives. And then self-care. So having the student athlete define what self-care looks like to them and making time to engage in those practices in their lives to connect deeper with themselves, to help with rejuvenation and a refresh, and ultimately to reduce symptoms of burnout. So that pretty much concludes our presentation. We do have some questions for you all, maybe to be thinking about and be mindful of in your work as you take tools with you. So the first is, how have you noticed student athletes' engagement pertaining to burnout? What barriers do you see coming up when discussing topics related to burnout with student athletes? And what tools can you visualize yourself implementing with student athletes to reduce burnout symptoms? And then, of course, if y'all have any questions for us.
Thank you, Sam and Melissa. For the questions, do you want them to just put them in the chat and I can read them off to you guys? So if anybody has any questions or comments or feedback, feel free to put that in the chat right now, and I will get it to them. Or if anybody has any responses to the 3 questions that Sam asked and you want to talk about those, feel free to put those in as well. No questions yet, but I will say, I have noticed student athlete engagement pertaining to burnout, and I would agree. I think some of it is a little bit of combination of their A-type personalities and wanting to be the best, especially at this level, but also maybe trying to be that person to represent their family, they're back home and things like that. So the extra pressure and stress, and also I would say a little bit of coming out of COVID, feeling like they definitely have to perform and things like that. So maybe they're double training, maybe they felt like they weren't in shape and things like that. So I'm definitely seeing it on with some of the student athletes that I work with. So
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Erica.
I do have one question. It said, thank you for your presentation. Have you noticed anything with student athletes that are using their COVID year? So maybe this is their 6th year because of COVID or whatever like that. Have you noticed anything in the literature? Did anybody happen to mention that of the 12 participants that you had?
Some of them mentioned a sense of urgency. It was almost like panic. It was like, this is my last year. I have nothing, like I have to give it my all. Everything must be perfect. And if it's not, I'm gonna freak out, to put it simply. So I've almost seen like paralysis by analysis with some of them. Like they're just overanalyzing everything that they're doing, and it's getting to a point where they just exhaust themselves. So I have seen that in a couple of student athletes that I've worked with. How about you, Sam?
I definitely agree. I think some individuals are at that point where they are ready to be done and maybe not even want to utilize that year. And for others, like feeling like you are running out of time and what will come next and not really knowing what that looks like.
Yeah. And
It says, go ahead. Sorry. I was going to read another question for you, but if you wanted to finish up with that, you can.
Well, I just saw that Mary put something in the chat that some 6-year student athletes have gotten their hopes up for their final year. Like, this is the year. And then most of them are really unsatisfied with the ending, which is so hard to see. But yeah, Mary, that's spot on. Totally agree.
And not only that, to piggyback off of Mary's comment, like maybe they transferred to a new institution.
Yes.
And saying this is going to be the year and there's a coaching change, or, you signed up for something that this was not what you expected. Ellie, I had a question and said, I would be interested to see how a student athlete's academic success level / background plays into their burnout level as well. So
some of the high achievers academically that we saw in our very small sample, Ellie, good to see you, Ellie, by the way, I miss you. Thanks for coming. The ones that were like high achievers academically, they almost felt a sense of like being underwhelmed when they're disassociating from their sport. It wasn't predominantly a sense of like, I'm so exhausted, like I can't do this anymore. Or it was more of the psychological, like, okay, I'm gone. But that'd be a very interesting thing to consider.
There was also just another question about the academics. Taylor mentioned this will be also interesting for student athletes that are starting the graduate program and transitioning to see that the different levels of workload and commitment.
Yeah. And also like across programs, I feel like there's some programs where it's like, oh, I'm going to coast by, like we're good. And then there's like some of the MBA students are like, I'm not going to survive. There's a wide variety for sure. Yeah, looking at programs, there's so many different constructs that play into this, y'all. It is fascinating. And I think, Erica, you mentioned transfers earlier. I'm like, the transfer portal, like, oh my gosh, that could be a study in itself.
Yeah, there's a session going on with that too.
Yeah, I saw that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Oh, I think I have a new one. Hold on.
Oh, Mary, we gotta talk, my girl.
Mary said they're adding a senior level class to help them debrief and prepare for the real world transition. Yeah.
So Mary, with student athlete development, on our side of the house, we're doing something called Tiger Transition meetings, to where we're meeting one-on-one with all juniors and seniors before they graduate to try to assist with this too, but get them in a class. I love that idea. It needs to be more than just one meeting.
Yeah,
Mhm.
if I can actually speak to that,
Yeah.
it's kind of interesting because we do all this orientation with freshmen, with transfers, we do all this onboarding process, but we don't really do an offboarding. And I think with kind of honestly COVID added to it, but a lot of things did. People are losing their identity faster, I think, than they usually have because of that shock to their system. It was kind of like going in cold water.
Yep.
And so we are really in the process of adding in like a class that literally is, how do you find that identity again? How do you get involved in the community? How do you use that degree you just earned? Those kind of things, because I think COVID's kind of pushed that off for some people in their head. Like I talked about the one more year thing, like next year's the romanticized of the next year, well, now I've got a little bit longer. There's not that finite, like you're done. It's more of, they prolong it. And so we haven't had those conversations. And so now we need to start having those conversations of like, what's next for you? And it doesn't mean you have to have it all figured out, but let's try to start figuring it out kind of thing. So
Mary, if you want to talk about my dissertation offline at any point, that's what I studied for about 4 years.
100%.
So when they go through that identity foreclosure and they're completely committed to their sport and they don't want to explore anything else, it's really dangerous. And I see Sam nodding her head. What do you want to throw in there, Sam? What do you got?
I was just gonna add how in working with sports, like that's something that comes up, like students who are in their final year and they know that they're going to be transitioning out of sport and wanting to talk about that because they are aware that it is going to be this loss of identity. I ended up creating a group with Sports Psych that is an identity exploration group to help facilitate those types of conversations, because it is so important. And a lot of times student athletes do envision their entire identity as related to their sport. And so that was a way that we could talk about values and strengths and interests and all of those things that can be a part of their sport, but also what that looks like outside of it.
that's awesome. Thank you, both of you. I'm going to pick both of your brains.
Looking forward to it. Taylor was dropping some knowledge in the chat. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just looking at that. No, and I was gonna say, any closing remarks, Sam or Melissa, like, were you surprised by the result? Was this like, yep, this is what I expected or anticipated, or was there any like aha takeaways from it?
I think that I wasn't expecting for all the student athletes that were interviewed to be so open to talking about burnout and their personal experiences with it. I think that was kind of alarming. And it was interesting to really see that this is a topic that they've thought about and that they've been struggling with and probably haven't been super open with other people about struggling with this.
And honestly, I think catching them like right before finals are about to start and like the end of their competition seasons, like they were ripe and ready to talk about this stuff. So I think that definitely contributed to it as well. But that's a great point, Sam. I think I didn't expect it to fall so perfectly within the already created theoretical framework of what burnout looks like. It was just a really real life, tangible example of how it's happening, particularly at a Power 5 institution at the Division I level. So really interesting.
Perfect. That was so. Any last questions, remarks from anyone? While you're thinking of things, and as we're closing down this session, I would like to share the evaluation screen. So if you guys can, do you have it, Sam?
Yeah, this is it.
Okay, there you go. Yep. I wanted to remind people to make sure they kind of use the QR code and do your session evaluation. So we can take away. And I think if you want, I know some people have reached out and asked for Dr. Weintz's contact information. So Dr. Weinsz, if you can maybe throw your email address in there, same with Sam. Oh, there you go, Sam.
Yeah.
That would be helpful for some folks as well.
Thank you, everyone. Great job, Sam.
All righty. Thank you, everyone.
Yes, thank you.
All right, I hope everybody has a great rest of their Friday and their weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.